Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's been a minute. Today is Friday, March 18th, 2022. This is Michael Bracy welcoming you to our next edition of Music Policy Forum Live, our monthly conversation program where we talk about strategies, policies, initiatives, best practices, all sorts of ideas around what can we collectively do to build, strengthen, and try to foster stronger, more resilient, and more equitable music ecosystems here in the United States and across the globe. We, as always, are so appreciative that you are here with us today. We know you have enormous demands on your time, beyond which in many parts of the country. It's beautiful today. It is March Madness. It's the day after St. Patrick's Day. So we assume a lot of you are watching via the website in terms of our video archive, but a lot of you are with us today, and we appreciate it. If you're so inclined, for those watching live, if you want to put your name and who you are and where you're joining from in the chat, we always love to see that. Don't feel obligated if you want to just stand by and lurk. We've got a great show today. We're going to be talking all about policy and advocacy, really with a federal focus. With a couple of really special guests that we'll be getting to in just a minute. Other housekeeping, we'll be taking questions through either the chat or the Q&A window. If you have specific issues that you're curious about or like to learn more about, and we can try to get to as many questions as we can. And if we can't answer them, we can certainly probably point you in the direction of some resources who might be able to answer them. Beyond that, as most of you who've joined us before know, we always welcome your feedback and your ideas and constructive criticism. You can always email us at musicpolicyforum@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and that helps us choose topics moving forward. So with that introduction, I'm going to start by bringing in our MPF board member, Kate Becker from King County. Kate is going to join us just for a minute here at the front as a special guest. It's great to see you as always, Kate. How's Seattle? How's King County?
Michael, we're getting by, but I'm not going to as many shows as you have gone to in the last, 72 hours or something. So way to go. Way to get back to it, Michael.
Yes, thank you. I feel like a very old, what is the butterfly emerging from the thing that it's been in for years. So, I have been. I was really fortunate to do a quick visit to South by Southwest last weekend, mostly there for some film stuff, but it was great to be in Austin and see a bunch of our music policy friends. I was able to do a quick trip up to New York yesterday, and I'm really excited. I know we're going to miss you, Kate, but a bunch of us are going to be meeting out in Boise for Tree Fort next week. So it's exciting to get back on the road and all that good stuff. And I know you've got a lot on your plate. So, but I'm seeing from my social feeds, it looks like you're back at it. It seems like music's happening again. People are going out to see shows. It seems like there's a lot of energy out there.
Yeah, there is a lot of energy out there. Shows are selling out again. People are having full houses. These things are good. Hopefully everyone's thinking about their health as they're doing that, being careful where they need to be careful. But yeah, it's a little bit of still a rocky time, Michael, but we're getting, yeah.
Yeah. And I know that, there's some disappointment that our community was not able to get additional resources in the final congressional omnibus that passed this last week. So it kind of feels like, SFOG money is probably the end of, additional resources unless we face another calamity. So that's tough. I know restaurants are still feeling stretched. I mean, it's still a hard time.
Indeed, absolutely. And it is the end of the ARPA funding cycle, right? So, there's not a lot of funding there for public health anymore either. So it's going to be a really interesting time as we move forward out of this without additional resources. So we're all going to have to stick together and do the best we can in each of our respective environments to contribute to the whole, because it's unknown where we're headed now, but hopefully we are. Yeah.
So Kate, I wanted to just check in with you on two specific topics real quick before we bring in our federal advocacy leaders. Because I think, one of the takeaways, hopefully, from today's program is everyone have a sense of what makes sense for them to be doing as they're thinking about either what platform they work in or their organizations or kind of what networks they're in. And and fills them confidence in terms of ways they can best engage with advocacy or with the policy conversations that are happening. And I wanted to make sure we don't give the short shrift to what happens at the local level, not only in terms of local policymaking, but in how the local relates to the federal. And could you speak a little bit about, I mean, one thing we all know right now, there's a lot of American Recovery Program money floating around that cities and states and counties are still trying to kind of put through their systems. I mean, is that something that you still have out in your region?
We have expended most of ours out in our region in King County, and it's my understanding in the city of Seattle. Some of the smaller cities around in the county still have some funding. So make sure, when you're meeting with your folks, your electeds, that they know what the need is, that they understand. Don't presume that they know how music venues operate or how performing arts organizations operate. They may or may not understand the need there. So really advocating for what the need to be and making sure that your electeds and your political leaders who have influence over that funding know about it, whether you're sending emails or showing up at a council meeting, but make sure that they have some understanding of the issue. They cannot advocate for you without it. So, and that ties to the federal, right? Because what gets done at the local level then gets elevated to the state level, and then the senators and the representatives carry it forward at the national level. So, it's all important.
And let's just speak real quick. And this, I don't know if this is just totally obvious to everybody who's participating in today's program, so I apologize. We certainly don't mean to be patronizing. Hopefully this is kind of new thinking for some of the folks on the call, but one of the dynamics that I want you to kind of think about or speak to is the fact that your bosses, the elected officials in King County, they are responsible for crafting priorities that they want the federal delegation, the senators and the Congress people to be prioritizing. And simultaneously, the senators and the congressional leaders often are going to go back to the local leaders to ask them what's important. So there's this two-way street about, what the locals want to have happen and what the feds want to have happen, but they want to make sure the locals are also think it's a good idea or they're prioritizing it. So could you just speak again? I mean, I think you kind of just spoke to a little bit, but also just in terms of making sure that your local officials are engaged because of what's happening on the federal conversation. So it's not just asking for local money or local policy, but it's right. And a great example of that. And again, you have remarkable advocacy infrastructure in Washington State, but the way that independent venues, Washington State, can help educate King County officials about why the shared venue money was so important, for example.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example, Michael. So, there was a lot of need all over the place, and there still is, of course, and vulnerable communities and populations are a high priority for local government. At the same time, really making sure that they understand that if venues stay business, then cultural workers stay employed and musicians stay employed, and that you prevent people from slipping over that edge into really needing those vulnerable community resources, right? But sometimes that needs explanation. They don't inherently get that. So really taking the time to meet with your local people for the very reasons that you just said, Michael, is because it can influence national policy. And, using whatever resources you have, whether that's using your social media platforms or whether it's because you're able to convene a bunch of people to meet with an elected official and tell the stories. But yeah, it is important that they understand it so that they can advocate for it. I don't know if I'm actually answering your question well.
No, I think you are, Kate. This is the conversation I wanted to have. I just wanted you to kind of speak to that and validate that. And I think the other, again, this is a gross generalization, but maybe you could reflect if this has been something you've seen in your experience, that sometimes local politics can get very personal because it is local. Yeah. And sometimes there's a sense of being let down, or people are not being, you're not delivering for me, or I need something. And I guess I just would want to encourage everybody, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Kate, but, to not just be going in to your local officials with a demand or a request or something you need, but just making sure you've maintained that dialogue and those relationships just across the board.
Yeah, so important. Absolutely. Because, when budgets come up, electeds get slammed with folks who want to come talk with them. But you are absolutely right, Michael. That education process along the way, and inviting them to come see what you're doing. Once they have firsthand experience, that can be really invaluable, and it can really turn their thinking about what they're willing to put their shoulder into and advocate for on your behalf. So maintaining that relationship is important. Having some easily digestible information that tells your story, really important too. So yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. And I'm going to just one last thing I'd love for you to flag. There was some exciting news. I thought exciting news over the last week or so with the formal launch of the national network of whatever we call them, the nighttime economy managers. I'm forgetting the term of art that they're using with their organization, but could you share, I know you're not formally part of that network, but I know you're close to a lot of those people. Could you speak to kind of what that organization does and why is it important to have these sort of leadership networks and that connectivity?
Absolutely. I don't know if Scott Pluskolek is on the call today, but he is our Seattle nightlife business advocate. And he and a whole bunch of other folks around the country, known as night mayors, a lot of them, but leading in the nighttime economy, have formed together and formed an organization called Nite Cap, NITECAP, Nite Cap. And they've just launched. But it's so important to focus on the nightlife economy and culture. So much is missed in the thinking about that. And often when you talk about it, folks think, oh, you're just talking about bars. Really, there is far more than bars happening in the evening hours, and so much more that we as communities should be focused on. And a lot of folks don't get out at night, so they don't really realize the magnitude of what's happening in the evening hours. So I am thrilled that Nite Cap has launched and that it has great potential to shed some light on what happens in the late night hours and why it's important for communities to tune into that.
Thank you, Kate, for that. And yeah, Scott is in the chat. Thank you, Scott, for saying hi. And we look forward to having Nite Cap on a future program. And I think, so Kate, thank you for joining us. And we'll bring, actually, Heather, I'm going to ask you to join us first. And one of the reasons I wanted to connect the dots between Nite Cap and the federal conversation is that when we talk about arts and culture, we have to think holistically. We have to think about the way that music and culture relates across the spectrum of things that policymakers care about and that the federal government cares about. And so, Heather, welcome. We're so thrilled to have you.
Hi, it's great to be back with you.
Yes, and so why don't we start? You've been on the program before, but for those who haven't had a chance to meet you, would you discuss briefly just the two of the hats that you wear, but the hats you wear in today's conversation, both with the league and also with CAG?
Sure. So I am the Vice President for Advocacy for the League of American Orchestras, and we're the national service organization for the 1,600 orchestras all over the U.S. Our headquarters are in New York. I haven't seen our New York headquarters in over 2 years. But we have a two-person Washington, D.C. office. My colleague, Nejin Lee, and I represent orchestras at the federal policy level. And we also provide technical assistance to our members to navigate all aspects of federal policy. But as you can imagine, the federal policy level issue areas are rarely exclusively about an orchestra-specific topic. So most of our time is spent in coalition with the broader array of arts and cultural organizations, humanities organizations. We also have a lot of strong partnerships with our colleagues in the broader nonprofit sector as well. And so we work collectively to advance a slate and shape a slate of federal policy issues. One of the groups that we're a part of is a formal alliance called the Performing Arts Alliance. So that's a performing arts specific coalition. And then we're part of, and I think this is probably what you'd like me to dwell on more, ad hoc coalition of national and state level advocacy groups called the Cultural Advocacy Group. This has been around for more than 20 years. There's no letterhead, there's no dues. It's just folks showing up together and talking about how to collectively advance our priorities. And a lot of those really took a totally different shape in the last couple of years. And that experience of moving through the pandemic and a policy orientation, I think, is also reshaping what we do next as a collective group.
So not to date you and me in terms of our advancing years, but one of the reasons I'm always excited to talk to you is that you've been doing this for a minute. And I think that people who, have sort of lived, I've been very fortunate to do versions of this work for over 25 years. And there's something about being sort of embedded in the small town to sort of just understand how it works and the mechanics of how policy actually gets made. And, I want to talk with you about a couple of things. First, I think that it's always fascinating when you have this transition in administrations, because the town literally changes. It's literally people moving out of jobs, new people moving in, and sometimes a slow process of the Senate confirming appointees, nominees to get them into, kind of position. But could you speak a little bit to kind of the Biden administration now? We're, a little bit over a year in. Clearly, it's been unusual times because of pandemic and a lot of other factors that are complicating sort of getting government up and going. But now it feels like we're kind of getting to the point where most of the key positions that would impact the things that we care about are sort of getting staffed and they're kind of getting moving.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's an interesting time to think about where the policy opportunity is, because with pandemic relief moving through Congress over the last couple of years, there's been so much activity and actual bills getting written and passed, which is usually a much slower process at the federal level. But now that we've hit an election year, the opportunities to move legislation on the Hill are going to narrow really quickly, right? So we saw a big omnibus package come through last week. That was one of the last trains leaving the station this year in terms of major federal policy that could win bipartisan support and cross the finish line. I can, in a moment, I can talk about our remaining goals for this year, despite the legislative logjam. But what it means for us as advocates is we can reshift that bandwidth, that advocacy bandwidth, to really focus on the administration and what it can do under its own authority without an act of Congress to support the arts and arts policies. And you're exactly right. It's actually typical that it should take this long before an administration truly settles in, gets its appointees in place, and then when they're in their own position of power to actually set policy under a new administration. And we're just now hitting, it's not true across the board for all federal agencies, but in a number of them that matter to our issues, we're hitting a little bit of a comfy spot now where folks are able to make some decisions. We have requests in front of them, and they're taking meetings. We've got new leadership now in place at the National Endowment for the Arts. So that's one example. One issue that we care deeply about, and that's increasingly important now that you're traveling again, right? And a number of us are, is international artist mobility issues. What's going on with visas so folks can come here and perform, what's happening with traveling with musical instruments that contain all kinds of old material that's now regulated under international treaties. And so we actually had the first public engagement, for instance, with the new director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That happened just 2 weeks ago. So a lot of these agencies are doing their initial outreach to public stakeholders and starting to shape new policies.
And my sense typically of how this works is that you would have, so different administrations think about arts and culture in different ways, and they think about the role of the federal government in different ways. And, it felt like we had some momentum in the Obama 2 terms around, again, this kind of holistic understanding or exploration of how, for example, Department of Housing and Urban Development impacted arts and culture and what that interplay was, and a real curiosity about how does government writ large, how do these pieces fit together, and not making a partisan statement, just making just an observation. The last 4 years under President Trump was not as much sort of interest in sort of figuring out those levers and kind of how the jigsaw puzzle fit together. But do you get a sense now with the team coming together for the Biden folks that it's sort of picking up the baton from where some of the Obama thinking was, and there's sort of this interest in cross-agency collaboration and sort of trying to figure out how arts and culture is central to multiple agendas, not just arts for art's sake, but how art plays in education, for one example.
Yeah, I think one of the big differences is that we saw under the Trump administration a whole lot of action by executive order, right? A real one-way kind of administration of policy. You never knew what executive order you'd wake up to, right? It just kind of happened, it landed, and it was there for agencies to execute. Big difference we're seeing right now is that there's much more transparency and public engagement happening in the decision-making process. So what does that look like? At Immigration Services, it looks like they hold a public stakeholder forum. And if you show up, you actually get to talk and they listen, and then they'll ping you after and follow up. It's a real sense of engagement. I'm sure, as we head into the weekend, folks aren't going to be pulling up the Federal Register and wanting to read every published notice there, but it's a really important way, and Kevin will probably talk about this too, a really important entry point to federal policy making, which is that these agencies are publishing notices of what they're intending to do. And you'd be surprised how few people weigh in. And so if you do, the chances that you'll get heard are actually quite good. So whether it's the NEA resetting its strategic planning process as they've done recently, or really, really specific details of how's the administration going to implement this infrastructure bill that was passed, where are the arts opportunities there? I think we have a greater chance now to have some input, transparency, but it does require paying attention to a lot of moving parts and details all at once.
Yeah. So one of the, you touched on this, but just let's drill down a little bit more. I mean, one of the sort of interesting federal questions when we think about agenda setting and priorities and how do we define success is, kind of over the last 20 years, there's been this sort of ongoing challenge of how do we as advocates not look at something like just, for example, a 5% increase or decrease in NEA funding as a proxy for cultural policy. Like, how do we think bigger? How, what does it look like? And certainly, it was exciting and fascinating to see what happened around COVID relief and sort of really taking up the mantle, the idea that if they're going to be spending money, we can be in that conversation and need to be in that conversation. And through the work of a lot of different people, including, you and your colleagues, but a lot of people working together, to get more funding released through the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant than the combined 50-year history of the NEA and NEH combined. I mean, it's just remarkable to think about the scale of funding based on, kind of where we've been used to living. And of course, pandemic is unusual circumstances. Again, we're not going to spend our way to figure out cultural policy by getting the government to write a lot of checks. But what is your sense, or do you have a sense of as we come out of pandemic in your broader networks, what do people, what is the response to the Save Our Stages and Shuttered Venue money? And how are people thinking about trying to kind of insinuate themselves into, kind of broader policy conversations and funding conversations?
Yeah, I put a couple of links in the chat that provide a little context for this. And one is this cultural advocacy group came together when the infrastructure package was being shaped to think more systemically about the opportunities for the arts beyond, as you've said, some art-specific federal funding initiatives. So I included the link to that document, even though, infrastructure bill has come and gone, but we used the premise of that platform to consider what's the unfinished business there that we need to keep advancing. Mm-hmm. And the other link that I've added here is just, coming off of the omnibus package where we're trying to get some of those primary asks inserted. We want to be primed and ready for whatever the next vehicle is going to be. So what you'll see in the second link is just this isn't all of the requests that the arts and humanities sectors are advancing, but it's some of them. And among them are specific bills that have been introduced that recognize the creative arts workforce in a way that really hasn't happened in federal law. And a lot of the support that we're seeking is actually something that could be accomplished at an agency level, again, without the teeth of legislation having to be passed to make it happen. But I think one of the outgrowths of the shuttered venues infusion of funding and, everything that Kate said earlier about, recognizing arts workers is that it provides us a whole new opportunity to think more systemically about where federal support lives for us. So I think, the exciting opportunity to grow from gig workers being recognized in pandemic relief in a way they haven't before and asking, how does that translate into long-term federal policy? Super important. I also think that, one example for us in the nonprofit sector is even though, there's a lot of attention to direct grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, the biggest form of federal subsidy for the nonprofit arts sector is our tax exempt status.
Right.
And the benefits of charitable giving. And were it not for that tax exemption, these nonprofit arts enterprises just couldn't go on. So, we think about ways to make ourselves part of the bigger picture conversation about the nonprofit sector for the gig workforce, and really get embedded in the bigger picture policy conversations.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask I'd love for you to stick around, and Kevin, get your camera on because we're going to bring you into the conversation here in a minute. I want to ask another question, and I'm trying to think about how to word it without being just enormously self-serving and kind of arrogant. But what I would like to, let me do the me statement, and you can respond to the me statement. So part of what I was so impressed by the Save Our Stages campaign and all the work around that was it was grounded in a hyper pragmatic understanding of how to actually get a bill passed. And NEVA had the foresight to raise money, hire a lobbying team that then worked and coordinated with you and many, many others to kind of get everybody on the same page, to do the quiet negotiations that need to happen so everybody can speak with one voice and just work the system, which with legislation is extraordinarily hard because legislation is so messy and there's so much game theory involved, and it's not getting legislation passed is not just a matter of like getting a bill introduced or getting co-sponsors or having a hearing. It's like all these different pieces have got to line up to be able to get to where you need to get to. And my sort of, I've been beating this drum for 25 years. So this is, again, you don't have to agree with this, but I hope one of the takeaways from the success of Save Our Stages is a recognition that if our sector can finally figure out a way to invest more resources so the people on the Hill, the people working, around government advocacy, they're not just working for corporate interests that, where it has to be shoehorned into how does this, work for a company, which is, most lobbyists are paid because there's an economic interest, but really there's more of a movement towards growing that next generation of culture advocates that really understand how the process works and are really able to be on the Hill in the agencies, kind of fighting this. So I'm saying I would like 100 more of you is, I guess, where I'm going with this. Does that resonate with you at all in terms of how the disconnect between the scale of the need of the work that needs to be done and the relatively small size of the body of people who are able to kind of do that work?
Yeah, I've been an arts lobbyist for 28 years now, so we're about the same vintage, Michael. I think you need both at the same time. So our approach to federal policymakers has to be grounded in an understanding of where they are. And often the folks who work in DC and see these cycles year in, year out, we can get a sense of that realistic context. How do you frame the ask in a way that connects with where the policy leaders are? But the other brilliant strategy of NEVA was that they mobilized an army of local advocates who made it their full-time job in the midst of the pandemic to connect with members of Congress at a grassroots level. Members of Congress only care about lobbyists to the degree that they represent actual voters back home who will influence their next election cycle, honestly. So you have to have both parts. And it is 100% true. They do see the creative sector, the arts sector as kind of one thing. And we need to help them understand how complex we are. But at the same time, being able to funnel the limited energy and resource they have to focus on our priorities in a concise way, and be in agreement in what we're asking for, I think helps a lot. And I just want to circle back to something that Kate said about engaging elected officials in live performance events and music events, and just seeing your work, seeing behind the scenes of your work, because we're in an election year. Members of Congress will be spending more time in their home districts and states. And so it's a terrific opportunity to look at the congressional calendar. I can put it in the chat. We keep track of this and tell people, here's what they'll be back home. But show them your workforce in action.
Yeah.
That local story is what matters most to them.
Yeah. I think that's such great advice, and do it. I mean, we always talk about non-transactional engagement. Don't make the first time you meet them be like, here's my ask. Make the first time you meet them, hey, come to a show. Hey, can we come talk to you about our business? Whatever that is. That's awesome. Well, Heather, I want to touch base with you on a couple other issues if you're able to hang on for a little bit later. And remind everybody, if you have questions on specific issues, put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll try to get to them. But I want to bring Kevin Erickson from Future Music Coalition in and talk about some stuff that Kevin and his colleagues are working on. It's great to see you as always, Kevin. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, happy to be here.
And let's not assume that everyone on the call today knows what FMC is. So why don't you give the elevator story about this organization?
Research, advocacy, and education for musicians on the full range of policy issues that impact their lives and livelihoods. We work on everything. We sort of end up focusing on the gaps that other artist organizations aren't filling and trying to get everybody in federal policy who wants to be helpful to musicians to be able to know how to do that effectively.
That was a very good elevator pitch. That's very well done.
I've been practicing.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. So what's keeping me up at night on the advocacy stuff are the things that you're, I think, most focused on, probably out of anybody well, we don't need to have a competition about that. Things that you are concerned about are things that are keeping me up at night, because there are some real policy opportunities and some of the things I think Heather kind of referenced in terms of the administration coming together and some of the things that they're curious about or interested in, that I am hopeful that our sector can get our head around quickly, because they really could be transformative. And again, in Music Policy Forum world, we always talk about structures and sort of, at the local level, our music ecosystems are really dictated by the structures that sort of are established at a federal or even a global level. And if you don't change the structures, it's hard to kind of deeply impact the ecosystem. So these are sort of historic opportunities to bring some fresh thinking or new approaches into a whole host of things. So maybe you could just kind of run down a couple things on the administration side that you're thinking about. And why don't we start just again, we have such a range of experiences on the call today, so I don't want to be patronizing, but maybe we could just start with a quick definition about what's different between like executive agencies that the administration really controls the policy, and then independent agencies where they make appointments, but they are not really supposed to follow the White House. So can you speak like the FCC as an independent agency?
Right. So, I mean, I think you did a pretty good, like the Department of Labor is headed by somebody in the cabinet who is appointed by the president. The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, is one of the agencies that's an independent agency. So the president appoints a chair. There are 5 commissioners, typically 3 are the president's party, 2 are the opposing party. And, but they're statutorily independent of the president. So the president can't just decide they don't like the leadership and fire that person. Like it's Senate confirmed, but there's a different process. And so, it's like there's a whole lot of sustained engagement. We talk about lobbying in terms of Congress all the time, but there's similar kinds of administrative advocacy that has to happen all the time with both the independent agencies and then the other agencies as well. But because the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission both have an important role to play in addressing issues of corporate concentration. That has been an issue that I've been focusing a lot on. Anybody who talks to me knows that I get wound up about this, but I do think it is the case that it's the biggest problem in music, that too few companies have too much power. And that is the thing that's impacting every part of the music community, musicians, music businesses of every type, venues, journalism, and media. So it has to be addressed directly by, legislation is part of it, and we can talk about specific pieces of legislation. But these agencies, FCC, FTC, and also the Department of Justice has an antitrust division. Engagement directly with them by the full range of impacted stakeholders is really, really important because they work for us and they want to hear from us. But we are impacted as a music community by the choices that they're making, and if they're only hearing from the big guys, they don't know how to do things.
So we have kind of a historic figure as the chair of the Federal Communications Commission, the first woman who's confirmed to be the full-time permanent chair, Jessica Rosenworcel, who is someone who has been around Washington for decades, working at the Senate, working at the Federal Communications Commission. Her brother is a professional musician, plays in the band Guster. You'll meet a lot of policymakers that claim to like music and it's kind of like you roll your eyes. And then, but someone who actually has it in the family and has really been, sort of living this journey from radio consolidation, net neutrality to where we are today. So Chairperson Rosenworcel is starting to kind of map out her agenda. Now she's got a little bit of a road bump because the Senate has yet to confirm the fifth commissioner. Is that right?
That's right. And we have a similar situation at the FTC where we're waiting for the fifth commissioner there as well. So if they don't have the full 5 commissioners at both of those places, they can't vote effectively on anything that's controversial. So even things that are in progress, like so for right now, since 2019, we've been working with our friends at Music First in trying to stop this plot by the biggest broadcasters to allow further consolidation of ownership in radio broadcasting. We want to see more local ownership, more local music, more diversity of voices in radio broadcasting. But for them to be able to actually do anything on that, they need to have all 5 commissioners. And so that's held up until we get a Senate vote on the 5th commissioner, Gigi Sohn. And a similar situation at the FTC, waiting for Alvaro Bedoya to get confirmed. That's sort of where we're stuck for now.
So we don't have time to do justice to all this stuff. So let's just very, very briefly. So the Federal Communications Commission is going to be doing public processes where they're looking for comment related to whether they've got media ownership in terms of who owns radio stations, you said. Are there any other big ticket items that you're looking forward to out of the Federal Communications Commission that relate to the music conversation in the next year or so?
I think in terms of new dockets opening up, one thing that I expect will happen before the FCC is they do a communications marketplace report where they report out to Congress about the state of competition in among other things, audio. And so that's an opportunity for the music community to weigh in and just say, here's what it looks like from our perspective. We would like to see more local ownership. We describing what some of the barriers to entry are. So the things that make it harder for smaller businesses to compete in that environment, which can include, some issues that the FCC doesn't have jurisdiction over, the difficulties that the journalism is facing, a whole host of things. That's one thing that'll be coming up at FCC.
Okay. And then again, we're given the short shrift. Today's program is just to give a sampler plate of things that are kind of on everybody's brains. Federal Trade Commission is really making some moves.
Yeah. So mark your calendar, April 27th. They've just announced a set of listening forums on mergers and acquisitions. Concurrently, they're doing a study on what the rules jointly with the Department of Justice about when they're going to allow or how they're going to do merger enforcement. So if you or your community is being impacted in any way by companies merging, by anti-competitive practices that result from that, I could just start throwing out names, but Live Nation, Ticketmaster, for example, if you've been impacted by these things or you have a point of view, they want to hear from you. So they're having a listening session specific to, I think they said media and entertainment, but they're not going to, any arts business that shows up that day, they're going to be happy to have you there. You have the opportunity to sign up and actually offer public testimony, city council style, for 2 minutes. And then apart from that event, there's a comment opportunity. Do not worry that your comment is not fancy or legal enough. They're really looking to just get a snapshot of how things are feeling on the ground from the most diverse possible range of stakeholders.
And I think, Kevin, I'd love for you to just emphasize the point that people do not need to feel like they need to have answers or solutions. So again, this is not congressional lobbying, like I want you to pass this bill. This is a problem I'm having in my sector that may be of interest to you. This is something that, where consolidation or concentration is been problematic for me as a independent promoter or someone who's trying to put on a festival or as an independent record label or as an artist that's concerned about DSP payments, et cetera?
Right. Today I was talking to a friend at a record label, and they're learning that like Amazon is forcing them to discount the retail price of the vinyl that they're selling, and so they're forced to sell vinyl to Amazon cheaper than they are able to the independent record stores that they really feel are their allies, and that disadvantages local businesses. Describing those kinds of practical details for the FTC and making those things accessible to them. Like, this is the problems that arise when, again, too few companies have so much power. They want to hear about that.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked, and Heather mentioned this, we have other departments coming together in terms of agency leadership. We have Marty Walsh at Department of Labor. There's been a lot of really exciting energy in our related communities around Music Workers Alliance, around being arts hero, around really trying to elevate the realities of what does it mean to be a creative worker or part of the gig economy. I don't believe we have a lot of specificity on Department of Labor actions, and Heather, please jump in at any point if there's anything that I mentioned that you want to speak to, but we can anticipate that Secretary Walsh is going to be engaged in these questions. So we're kind of looking to see what that's going to look like. Is there anything else, Kevin, before we turn to Congress, anything else significant on the agency level that you want to speak to?
I think I think some of the congressional stuff has implications for the agency stuff as well. So I think we can hit it through that angle. Yeah.
Well, one thing we can touch before we move to Congress is there's been a lot of conversation around the structural data challenges where the federal government is not really set up to fully get a full data picture of the realities of the emerging creative economy. And that potentially that could even go down to things that are called, NAICS codes, just ways that they code things and sort of map things through data collection. Heather and I were talking a little bit about this the other day. I don't know personally if there's anything specific to try to address that would ideally be, or I believe would be fixed through a rulemaking at the Office of Management and Budget. I think is responsible for that. And now that the OMB leadership was finally confirmed last week, there may be ability to get some traction on just trying to address the NAICS codes issue. But again, I love that issue because issues like that, because there are all these things that are not low-hanging fruit, but they're lowest hanging fruit. They're not controversial. There's not like you're asking Congress or policymakers to choose between, like a big industry fight. You're just like, hey, federal government, you don't really understand how the creative sector works. If you modernize the way you collect this data, that might give you a better snapshot. So that might be fixable and could be really useful.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, great approach. Even data can be controversial. We had a conversation with FCC this week on wanting to get them gathering more data from broadcasters about about changes in ownership concentration over time. And could you at least sort of, as you're gathering this data, apply the standard metrics of that economists use, so we can get a clearer picture of how things have changed over time. And there's even pushback at that point because the broadcasters don't like it, the picture that comes from that data. But on something like those codes on employment classification issues, like the only pushback that you get is just sort of inertia. The status quo wins, and unless we just keep pushing. Right.
I can't resist, if you're talking about data and agency action, I can't resist saying there's also the data that just doesn't exist at all that needs to be out there. And one of our primary requests to the U.S. Department of Education is that they finally collect data on access to arts education in the public schools, because we know there are huge equity gaps. And when you can point to them and you can demonstrate that the highest poverty schools have the least access to arts learning, it fuels policy change. So I would just say on the music education front, one of our top priorities for this administration is that they have more transparency around the access gaps in arts learning. And that's something they could do at an agency level. If it isn't a priority, then that's when you shift to a congressional mandate that will tell them within fiscal year 23, you must do this, maybe with some dollars attached to it. But the data really does inform policy, and to the degree we have it in whatever agency or whatever topic, it really strengthens all of our policy asks.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. And I think, let's unpack that a tiny bit in terms of, as we kind of shift to, so the congressional conversation. So Congress really does 3 or 4 things, or 5 or 6, but I mean, and they're distinct things that Congress does that sort of impact our sector. And one of them certainly, so you've got funding, so you have the annual appropriations. Great question from James Lockridge in the chat, just around the eligibility for small non-com radio stations and their inability to tap into CPB money, and who would even address that? I mean, would that be done through, I don't even know if CPB has I don't think they have the authority unilaterally to choose to fund smaller stations even if they wanted to. I think that would have to be done by congressional action, which potentially would be tied to appropriations. So when CPB gets their annual appropriation, there would be language that says, by the way, we want you to also fund these other types of stations, which would be a challenging political knot to untie, but is doable. But that potentially is how the funding cycle sort of not only is about funding itself in raw numbers, but it's about policy. Then you've got oversight. So we were excited for the Small Business Committee in the House to hold what I think is, I don't know, Heather, catch me if I'm wrong in this, but I think is the first standalone hearing on the power and promise of the creative economy.
Within the Small Business Committee, right?
Within that committee, yeah. And, big shout out to all the people that worked on that and participated in that and testified to that, and our friends at BN Arts Hero for helping shepherd that through. And so just the bully pulpit or putting attention on issues are really important and really helpful for Congress. And then they kind of sometimes pass a law. And, again, several years ago, we saw the passage of the Music Modernization Act, which was the first major piece updating copyright laws that relates to music since 1998.
Something
so
like
it
that.
took them a hot minute to kind of actually get all stakeholders together to kind of pass something. Kevin, you got some news today. Something kind of dropped on Capitol Hill that is it strikes me as a kind of issue that is not likely to pass in the short term, but is starting a conversation that everybody needs to be aware of and has huge implications for our sector.
Yeah, we've been I think of it as 3 tracks together, 3 bills that are working on various aspects of the recorded music marketplace and trying to restore some health and equity to them. The one that dropped today was the latest version of an idea coming from the Senate, Senators Tillis and Leahy, on Section 512 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. I think they called it the SMART Act of 2022. So the DMCA.
The SMART Act?
The SMART Act, the Strengthening Measures to Advance Rights Technologies.
Good branding. That's always fun to see how people brand their bills. So yeah. They're smart. Good. All right.
So the DMCA does a lot of things, but one of the things that it's supposed to do is set up this balance where if a copyright owner submits a notice of infringement to a platform, then the platform has an obligation to do something about it, to take it down. And as long as they abide by this process, they aren't liable for the stuff that their users upload in terms of copyright law. The problem has been that the balance has been off. It hasn't always been working as designed. The statute was meant to create standard technical tools that made it possible for artists to deal with infringing work on the platforms. But there wasn't ever any consensus that came about how those tools would be manifested. And what's happened instead, that services have made their own proprietary anti-infringement systems that some of them work well, but they have some problems. And they're not being made available on a neutral or non-discriminatory basis. The companies can sort of leverage them for their own commercial gains. And effectively, that's meant that smaller artists and rights holders haven't had effective control over their work. And, I think the creators have a range of frustrations, copyright claims that are fraudulent or overreaching. Certainly, these systems aren't very good for classical music. But these are solvable problems, both technologically and in terms of policy. The Copyright Office has studied this and recommended some targeted fixes. Congress has followed up with more hearings. They're in the process of doing another study specifically on the technical side of it right now. This bill dropped today before the Copyright Office has finished that study. So I'm imagining that means that they're trying to send a message to the tech companies at this point that like they need to take this issue seriously. Now, if you're thinking this doesn't matter so much to me, the musicians in your community are not so worried about piracy, I would encourage you to think about it as sort of like a broader, as long as there's one part of the market where musicians aren't getting paid anything, it impacts what musicians are able to get paid anywhere else. And so to the extent that there continue to be these broad frustrations with artist compensation on Spotify or competing services like that, this problem is one of the key reasons. And then the second big problem that undergirds that is the lack of a performance right on terrestrial radio, which is the subject of another bill, the American Music Fairness Act, which is also seeing some growing momentum right now.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to be skeptical about growing momentum on the performance right bill just because
well, we've been working on it a long time.
Working on it for 20 years, but is there slow and steady momentum, or is there any chance of somehow breaking the logjam and actually getting over the top, do you think?
I would say that the conversations that I've had with House Judiciary Committee folks have indicated a kind of confidence and a real willingness to get something done. I would say that the hearing that happened a couple months ago, Gloria Estefan testified. It was lovely. The tenor of it was really different. And we're also seeing endorsements from new corners. We're seeing, because the new bill is generous to small and non-commercial stations and recognizes the important value that they have for music communities. There's we got the endorsement of all of the small and non-commercial radio groups like Public Knowledge, who very rarely take positions in favor of bills that expand copyright. There's just more consensus forming around it than we've seen in the past. It's still a climb, it's still a fight, but there is a sense of urgency and a sense of optimism that I've been working on the issue for 10 years too, and it's like it feels really like the ground is shifting. Even in terms of the partisan makeup of it, like the tough questions that the broadcasters were facing from Republican members who had been, more hesitant to ask those kinds of critical questions in the past at the hearing, it was a real change.
Well, and just for those in the meeting who haven't followed this issue, it's just such a, we've got our friends from New Zealand on with us today. I mean, it is just preposterous that in the United States, that broadcasters have never had to pay for use of recorded music. They've been able to play it for free. They have to pay the publishing, but not for the public performance. And when the DMCA legalized webcasting back in 1998, it created the digital, royalty, which is, what's administered through Sound Exchange, and that's worked extremely well and become a really significant revenue stream for many musicians and others in the industry. And the major terrestrial broadcasters have been able to successfully argue since Frank Sinatra fought this in the 70s, that basically because they provide such promotional benefit for musicians that they should be, not have to, be liable to pay these royalties. And it's just not fair, and it's just silly. And it's the fact that it's still kind of being debated, at this moment in history is really something. So we have about 5 minutes. Again, if anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A. I want to bring Heather back in because I want to highlight a couple of the things that you touched on super briefly, but I think are so important in the work that you and Kevin and others do, which are the things that are not the big structural stuff, but like, okay, what's the sort of pragmatic day-to-day stuff that deeply impacts musicians that can be fixed if there's attention and spotlight put on it? But it takes a bunch of work. So you mentioned some of the instrument-related issues. Could you kind of speak to that in a little bit more detail? Nope.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, I sure can. So traveling with musical instruments, there have been issues whether you're traveling domestically or internationally around aviation. And that's a great example of where we actually, talk about working on something for 10 years, actually finally got across the finish line, right? So we actually have federal rules that basically say to an airline, if it fits, it flies. If you can fit it in the overhead compartment, if you can get it in cabin, there's no reason it shouldn't go, and that they also need to be responsible for how they treat musical instruments. So that's kind of a legacy issue, but it's one that we like to talk about a lot because I think folks forget that they have those rights, and it's important to know them and understand them and use them. On the international scene, for musical instruments, especially for guitar players, stringed instrument players, many of those instruments, as you know, they have a really long lifespan. And in the course from when they were made to when they're now in use, some of the material that are in them has come under protection as endangered species. So most here who are in the guitar world will be aware that Brazilian rosewood comes into these rules. There are proposals to uplist a whole new range of species, just given what's going on with climate change and the devastation of forests across the globe. So we are in a partnership with conservation organizations and the UN host of this treaty, which is called CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, to make sure that we can collectively support those uplistings with the appropriate exceptions for existing musical instruments that are already finished products and are in use across the globe or come onto the resale market across the globe. So I'll just, it's funny, having said that I haven't gone to my New York headquarters in 2 years, I did make a trip to France last week because now that the world is reopening, these negotiations are happening again. So we joined with European music instrument stakeholders to make sure that we're showing up. We're showing up in a conversations around protected species issues because you got to be at the table for those big picture dialogues. And then the other related issue is the artist visa concerns, and this kind of circles back to near-term opportunities to weigh in with the administration where literally every single problem we have in this area can be addressed under their own discretion through the Immigration Service and State Department consular processing. So again, with global travel coming back on the scene, being visible on these issues is really important. On the visa stuff, our best success in changing policy has always been attached to clear stories of when things went badly. So I would just appeal to everyone that if you have a circumstance where the visa didn't come through in time or the consulate didn't grant the interview, or we need case numbers, we need those stories, and we really can move the dial with that kind of, direct kind of story to tell.
And as we think about, part of what excites me so much over the last, nothing excites me about pandemic, but one of the things that has been exciting to watch come together is sort of a maturation of our field. And again, just in today's call, we have representatives from all sorts of different organizations, many of which didn't exist 3 years ago. As we think about like collecting stories and trying to think about that impact, what does that look like in practice? So if someone has got a nightmare story about getting an artist into a festival in New Mexico, do they call? They don't call you because that's not your job to like take calls from, all of our friends in New Mexico, right? How does that information sharing kind of get its way up the chain?
Well, there's a couple things you can do. I'm going to say overwhelm our colleagues at Tamizdat.
Yes.
They're there for this. So no matter what genre you're in, you can contact them with a case number, and they have a system called Avail, that's pro bono system to help folks with these issues. We work collectively with them to amass those examples and send them to the CIS Ombudsman's office. So talk about independent parts of these agencies. There is an ombudsman role that's about just navigating oversight of the agency and engaging with the public on where the problems are. I have to sneak in one more issue area, because when you talk about direct examples of pain points on the tax policy front, and there's going to be some kind of tax extender package that comes together, we're still trying to reinstate the deduction for the performing artists used to be able to take for their unreimbursed employment expenses. Yeah. And this is one where individual artists, you can tell this story. You can say, prior to 2017, here's what my tax picture looked like when I was able to take this deduction. And here's how much I've lost out. And here's why that's not fair. So I think, being able to contact Congress, your elected officials, you can tell these stories to them. And the same thing, honestly, with the visa issues. Each congressional office has a staff person who's tasked with helping with technical assistance. And if you contact them with a case number, it not only means they might be able to help, but it also goes on record that there's a problem.
I appreciate that so much. And that's one of the reasons the tax issues are one of the reasons I was flagging Secretary Walsh earlier, again, the former mayor of Boston, who is now the Secretary of Labor, who is extraordinarily artist friendly. And my hope, I don't have any inside information, but my hope and my anticipation is that as we move out of COVID into the next phase of our life, that is a real opportunity to have meaningful high-level dialogue at the Department of Labor about all of these issues. And then even if that's not something that Department of Labor can solve, as a key member of the administration, they have the ability to figure out, well, where does it get solved and how can they help be advocates across agencies or on the Hill if it's a congressional issue. So
yeah, Michael, I think maybe like I have one more example of that can wrap us up on a positive, like a win that we get to celebrate now, which is that HHS right now is in the process of implementing the No Surprises Act, which deals with surprise billing. It would be a problem in the past that even an insured artist would show up, would have a medical emergency on tour. And because the hospital was out of network, they would get saddled with this incredible bill that the insurance isn't covered. Or if they were uninsured, like too many musicians are, they would go in for a non-emergency procedure and get surprised by a bill that was way, way higher than what they expected. Both of those things have changed now, and that was, these are examples of the sort of like multi-agency approach. I also just want to it's nice to notice that as so much is continuing to be frustrating, that there's still wins that we can celebrate.
Exactly. Well, we are at time. And so, we knew going into this, there's no way to kind of shoehorn everything into an hour. But I know we all are so appreciative of the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And I know you would be the first to acknowledge all the people standing with you, all the different organizations. It really is a great community of collaborators who are trying to navigate these systems and try to kind of figure out how we can do better. Kevin is an amazing follow on Twitter. So at Future Music, if you're not following him, you should be following him. What's the best place to follow you and the work that you're doing, Heather?
So the League of American Orchestras does also have a social media presence, but probably the best way is to keep up with some of these links that I've thrown into, very many of them. We have a policy action center for every one of the issues that I've mentioned. And they can be adapted. They're customizable. If you're not an orchestra, you can still use these talking points. You can even use our system to stay in touch with your elected officials.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kate Becker, for jumping in. Thanks, as always, to Alex Dolvin for producing the program and making it go so smoothly. Again, we are so humbled by all of you who have joined us on a beautiful Friday. Please email us if you have comments, questions, ideas, suggestions, gently worded constructive criticism. We love to hear your feedback. I hope to see a lot of you out at Treefort next week out in Boise. Otherwise, be safe, go out, see some live music, and we'll see you in April. Thanks, everybody.